Welcome to the joint WFA and the Antrim and Down branch and the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland's first lecture in our new autumn series. Today's talk is going to be on football during the Great War. But before Tom introduces the speaker, I just want to say a few words about housekeeping. We haven't actually. I am going to mute you all. And then I'm going to unmute. Where's this speaker gone? Just bear with me. And where's Alex? I'm going to unmute Alex. So I'm unmuting everybody so that we don't have any background noise. And I would also suggest that because we're recording this, if anybody doesn't want to appear on the video, feel free to turn your video off as well. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Tom to introduce the speaker. Thank you. Oh, I've got to unmute him. Sorry, Tom.
I'm being unmuted. Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's talk. Tonight we have Dr. Alexander Jackson, who's going to talk about the English and Irish domestic football leagues during the Great War. Alex is a curator at the National Football Museum, and he's been doing that since 2011. And he is the author of a recent book on football during the First World War. And he was a guest on not my podcast, but the podcast of the Western Front Association, which is episode 255. If anybody would like to go and listen to that, and also his book, which is available at Pen and Sword. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Alex, who will tell us all about football in the Irish and English domestic leagues during the Great War.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm just going to attempt to start off by sharing the screen, my PowerPoint rather. Hopefully that is sharing now. Yep, getting the thumbs up, which is great. So I shall move on to the first slide. So I just want to say thanks to Tom for the invite, and a thank you to all coming along this evening. Tom's been very supportive of the book, so I hope the talk goes well and repays a bit of the kindness that he's shown me inviting me along tonight. As mentioned, I'll be looking at the role of football on the English home front and some of its connections to Ireland and Belfast. I'm going to try to do this through exploring the wartime experiences of three people, each with an Irish connection, and allow me to pick out some of the key themes from the book. And these are George Anderson, an English footballer with Manchester United, whose wartime career in England and Ireland sheds light on a wartime culture of illicit payments, gambling and corruption. So hopefully some good stuff to keep people interested there. William McCracken, arguably the most famous Irish player in 1914, and who played for Newcastle United. And his wartime career illustrates how male civilian players involve themselves in charity work to support the war effort. And then finally, Diana Scott, who's a really important figure in the rise of women's football in Ireland and the important place of Belfast in the development of women's international football in the 1910s and 1920s. Before I get into their stories, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of context to discussing how I came to be interested in the topic, and also the broader story of football on the English home front up to the summer of 1915. And then I'll look at those three individual life stories that kind of take us through from 1915 through to the end of the war. So, oh, not gone one minute. Sorry. There we go. So I've been interested in sporting and military history since as a child, sort of through my family getting me interested in those two particular topics. So when the National Football Museum decided it would create an exhibition on football during the First World War for the centenary in 2014, I was in a quite happy position of being able to bring my interests together. Entitled The Greater Game, the exhibition explored the place of football at home and at the front. And when it came to researching the exhibition, it became clear that the best known topics were those associated with the front lines, like the disputed and mythologized role of football in the 1914 Christmas truce, the use of footballs at the front. You can see here one in the slide, that was used by the Surrey Regiment. They kicked it ahead of their attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, one of several balls used by them. So as you can imagine, that's a ball with quite some history behind it. And also there was a lot of focus on the stories of individual players, often connected to the Footballers' Battalion, one of the more distinctive units raised through the Pals phenomena. All of this is not really surprising because it reflects the long established hold of the front lines on the popular imagination and in a lot of historical research. So in the exhibition, we did look at the home front story, looking at the controversial 1914-15 season and men and women's football between 1915 and 1918. And you can see the latter two sections in the other image used here. And within that, we've got morale and men's football on the left-hand side and women's football on the right. What I found interesting was the relative lack of information or interest in football's home front story, generally speaking. In all of the key histories of the home front, from Arthur Marwick in the 1960s to Adrian Gregory in the 2010s, football is referred to sparingly and usually with a focus on the controversial 1914-15 season, when professional football continued. Coverage of the men's game usually stops with the FA's decision to ban professionalism in the summer of 1915, which is often depicted as shutting down the men's game in England. Given this interpretation, the rise of women's football is sometimes depicted as filling a vacuum in the latter part of the years caused by the cessation of men's football. To understand how these sort of views arose to a degree, it's helpful to consider the state of the game on the eve of the war and how the 1914-15 season was seen at the time. So in 1913, the English FA celebrated its 50th anniversary. In that time, the game had moved.
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Oh, sorry.
Can I interrupt? Your slides aren't moving along.
Oh, my.
Sorry.
No, not at all. So, can you see that one? Should have two images.
No, you might need to go to see up from beginning on the.
So, I shall just. Sorry, my apologies to everyone for this. I shall go back to attempting to share. Why is that done that?
Yes.
So has that come up to cartoons? Are we seeing?
Two cartoons, yes. Sorry,
Excellent.
I'll shut up now.
No, so no, thank you very much I'm very sorry about that. I'm just going to, just before I start talking again, I'm going to go to the next slide just to make sure that uploads for everyone.
Yep.
Excellent. Yep. I have to say, I have no idea why that happened, but my apologies again. So yes, so as you can see on the left-hand side, we have a cartoon celebrating the Jubilee of the Football Association in 1913. We're celebrating its 50th anniversary when it had moved from being the recreation of a small number of social elites to both a mass participation sport and a major commercial entertainment that supported a new profession of paid players. As the Players' Union magazine on the other side shows King Football sitting on his thrones of bags filled with pounds, shillings and pence, which reflect the gate money, transfer fees, cup tie fees and income. And as the cartoon indicates, King Football was, in that sense, a ruler of a realm that incorporated many leagues and cups, all of which created this wealth. And this was replicated in all of the nations of the British Isles, particularly in Scotland, where the game occupied a particularly important place in Scottish life. And it also had an important role in Ireland with a particularly strong football culture in and around Belfast. The scale of spectatorship in England was impressive. The top 60 clubs in the English and Southern leagues attracted over 15 million spectators in the 1913-14 season, whilst the 1913 FA Cup final attracted a record crowd of over 120,000. And many fans watched in stadiums that are still in use today, like Old Trafford, which was newly opened in 1910 and regarded as a marvel of modern stadium design. But such modern gladiatorial contests, as critics called them, worried some middle and upper class commentators who saw them as distractions from the important business of maintaining the empire. And within the game, some middle class administrators brought up to believe in the superiority of the amateur ethos also found the commercial game's success problematic. There we go, next slide. So when the war came, the decision of the Football Association in England to continue attracted a great deal of criticism. These two images are one a recruiting poster, the other a cartoon from the Sheffield Telegraph sports special, illustrate the two sides of the argument. To some, football was a distraction that kept young men from volunteering and which devalued the sacrifices that servicemen and their families were making, especially when it was the ultimate sacrifice. Those elements of society which had opposed the game prior to the war were particularly vocal. In contrast, many in football saw these attacks as ignorant, ignoring the game's contributions to recruiting, to charity fundraising and maintaining military and civilian morale. And in the cartoon, you can see the sort of almost like a professional, what some people viewed as a professional critical mourner, banging the drum of cant as it's depicted below in the text, whilst the football in the background makes a helpful contribution to the war effort. The scale of these attacks, bolstered by elements of the right-wing press, is sometimes seen as forcing the game to stop due to public pressure, a victory for a small number of Puritans over the masses. In fact, many within football and amongst its supporters felt determined that their course was better, that practical patriotism was better for the war effort. Moreover, they objected to the class-based hypocrisy that saw football attacked, whilst horse racing and other commercial sports and entertainments continue without comment. So hopefully the next slide is showing. So while the anti-football campaign did have an effect on the FA's decision-making in 1915, it did not stop the game. And that's like, if I'm going to sort of like, hopefully people take one big thing away from tonight, it's there's a big football culture that it continues on through the rest of the war. What happened was in July 1915, the FA decided that the game should go ahead. The English FA decided the game in England should go ahead, but also decided to remove a principal objection to wartime football by banning the payment of players. And this contrasted with Scotland and Ireland, where payments continued, but were capped at about 25% of previous wage levels, so roughly about £1 a week. And as this cartoon shows, some saw this as a positive step that would allow the game to wash itself clean of the perils, dangers, and sins of professionalism that occupied pre-war writers and critics. As such, English football had a particular wartime experience in which middle-class amateur values were enforced on working-class professional players. And as we shall see, this would cause tensions and problems throughout the war. So before continuing to our first case study, I'd like to point out the popularity and scale of wartime football in England. As these figures and the image show, wartime football, whilst reduced in scale, remained a significant activity. So you can see from being around 15 million spectators in 1913-14, dropping in that first season of the war, and then dropping even further, partly through continued conscription, through volunteering and conscription, and spectators having to work more hours in munitions factories, but still remaining at a quite significant level throughout the war, and actually rising towards the end. You can see it rise slightly into 1917-18, despite cost of living increasing for many people. To avoid excessive travelling and to avoid keeping civilian players from their war work, regional tournaments in Lancashire, the Midlands and London provided the main fare for spectators between 1915 and 1918. And it's these games that are overlooked when it's claimed or imagined that wartime football essentially disappeared or was not significant in its nature. So I'm going to move to our first case study. Hopefully that slide comes through. And our first one is one that sheds a light on some of the controversy and corruption that resulted from the FA's decision to ban professionalism and enforce amateurism in England. In 1914, George Anderson was living the dream of many young Manchester United fans. A local lad and still only 23, he was an established first-team player. And by May 1915, he'd made a total of 86 first-team appearances, scoring 39 goals for the club. He'd also played in what had become one of English football's most infamous games, the 1915 Good Friday match-fixing scandal. 7 players from Manchester United, Liverpool, plus 1 from Chester, conspired to create a fix, to fix a 2-0 win for Manchester United over Liverpool that helped Manchester United in their relegation fight, and which also allowed the players to make money by gambling on the result. They were a little bit too obvious in their efforts, though, with their play arousing immediate suspicion and leading to an FA inquiry. The inquiry was still ongoing when the 1915-16 season started, and from the start, there were suspicions that clubs were illicitly playing their players. As this cartoon illustrates, as early as October 1915, rumours of illicit payments were circulating in relation to Stockport County, who were said to be paying their players £1 a week. And the Manchester Football Chronicle cartoonist here was pleased that a Football League investigation had scotched these rumours. You can see the dirty dog of rumour being hit on the head quite abruptly by a Football Commission investigation. But a few months later, the football world was shocked when the Commission into the Good Friday game announced its findings. In December 1915, they confirmed the fix had taken place, and 8 players from, I think I placed it 7 previously, players from Manchester United, Liverpool and Chester were banned for life. Anderson wasn't one of these players, but in January 1916, he moved to Belfast. He was one of a small number of English players who found reason to move to Ireland just as the Military Service Act was introduced into England, Scotland and Wales. And as a relatively prominent player, Anderson attracted the notice of England's leading sports writer, James Catton, who you can see here on the right. It should also noted that James Catton had an adult son from his first marriage who was also serving in the armed forces with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Catton was also a very proud patriot, encouraged recruiting. So in Catton's opinion, he wrote, "When every man should be helping his country to win the war, the action of some players seems remarkable." Belfast United denied that they had approached Anderson, arguing that he had been told to move by his doctor, and he had papers stating that he was medically unfit to serve in the army, and that he'd approached them, i.e. Belfast United, to play. This, we shall now see the response from the Manchester Football Chronicle. As we can see, they were clearly not convinced, alluding to Hans Christian Andersen's famous fairy tales, which were obviously popular at the time. To make matters worse, rumours circulated that players from English clubs were receiving secret payments from Irish clubs in defiance of the English FA's wartime ban on professionalism, which prohibited English players at English clubs earning money even if they were playing for Scottish or Irish clubs. Investigations moved slowly, though, emboldening one anonymous player who wrote directly to Catton to taunt him. And that player wrote, "I am and I have been playing as a professional in Belfast all this season at £1 or maybe more or less per week. But having taken the precaution never to indulge my proper name here, nobody knows and nobody cares who I am as long as I am worthy of my place. I'm a wee bit cuter than George Anderson, but like him, I have transgressed no laws and I don't care a fig for the FA." So Athletic News complained that it was sick of receiving news of English professionals receiving money in Ireland and called on the English FA and the English Football League to investigate. And eventually an Irish Football Association investigation found that Belfast United had been paying Tom McKenna, a professional from Grimsby Town, £1 per week, not the 10 shillings expenses he was meant to have been claiming. Several officials and Tom McKenna were banned. And when reviewing the whole case, James Catton made his feelings very clear to his readers. He wrote, "What did you do during the war must be a question put to footballers in the days to come, as to all other males of bodily fitness and military age. If a player has slunk out of England and scuttled away to save his own skin, his bag of bones will not be worth much in the future. There are a few who have crossed to Ireland. Was there, apart from military service, no work for these men in England? Did they want to work? Did they want to help in the best way that a civilian can in this country? Was it necessary to go to Ireland to discover a bit of work? These are questions which should be considered by the football clubs." So the FA went on to regulate the movement of players to Ireland to ensure that they were not paid, and that the reason they were leaving the country was not to avoid the Military Services Act. So having been involved in all of this, George Anderson was initially banned for life by the English FA. But after apologising, he was permitted to play again for Manchester United, which is in some ways seems like quite sort of either common sense or quite lenient approach by the FA, depending on your view. He then became a regular at Manchester United, and he was even made club captain in 1917. However, following reports of attempted match fixing, an FA inquiry again banned him for life in February 1918. And a few months later, Anderson was charged by the police with conspiracy to defraud. 7 players, including four of his Manchester United teammates, offered signed evidence that Anderson had approached them with cash inducements of between £10 and £60 to fix matches. Both Thomas Fleetwood of Everton and David Wilson of Oldham Athletic had reported Anderson's approaches to their directors, with Everton instructing Fleetwood to meet and actually accept bribes to obtain further evidence. Rumours circulated that Anderson had been working for a firm of Scottish bookmakers, whilst several players referred to Anderson being accompanied by an unknown figure, possibly a criminal behind the whole setup. Anderson denied everything, but after an hour's consideration, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to 8 months hard labour. Aged 26 and in the prime of his career at the time of his imprisonment, Anderson forfeited the chance of a successful post-war career. And with the distance of time, we might consider Anderson another victim of the war, lured as he was into the murky world of the fix. So for our second case study, and for a very different wartime experience, we can turn to William McCracken. In 1914, he was arguably Ireland's best-known player. Belfast-born, McCracken had played for Distillery FC between 1900 and 1904 before joining Newcastle United, and he was a pivotal figure in turning the Magpies into the team of the Edwardian period. They won 3 league titles, they reached 5 FA Cup finals, including their first ever win in 1910. And moreover, he perfected the club's offside tactics, earning plaudits from discerning sports writers and disdain from opposing fans on the terraces, who frequently directed fruit, pennies, pipes, and other missiles in vain attempts to distract him. All told, McCracken would play for 20 years for Newcastle United, both before, during, and after the First World War. But he only made 16 appearances for the international side of the Irish Football Association, due to falling out with their officials over the differences between payments made to English and Irish players for international appearances. This was a point of principle to him, and he stuck by it for quite some time. And he was also prominent in the Emerging Players Union. His wartime story is of a man arguably in love with football, who used his football stardom as much as possible to help the wartime effort. As a married man, McCracken remained a civilian throughout the war, and in this choosing to remain a civilian, or being able to, he was part of the majority amongst both the male population at large and the elite male professional footballers who chose not to volunteer in 1914 and 1915. So while many major clubs continued playing between 1915 and 18, some did not. The 3 major northeastern clubs of Newcastle United, Sunderland and Middlesbrough, along with Aston Villa, West Bromwich Albion, Wolverhampton Wanderers, and for a time Blackburn Rovers and Birmingham City, all chose not to participate in the Football League's regional football tournaments between 1915 and 1918. As we can see in this cartoon, others in the football community did not approve of this stance, arguing that more could be done by continuing. The image here has the clubs looking at a series of reasons for continuing in the style of a contemporary propaganda poster, and the focus is on supporting military and civilian morale, fundraising, and military recruitment. Aston Villa was seen as one of the ringleaders of this group of clubs, and you may have noticed, if you look, might be able to see if you look carefully, that the Aston Villa figure sports a rather Kaiser-like moustache, which is an interesting theme that appeared in several other cartoons across the war. the idea that continuing was the better option, which was one that was shared by many of the players for these clubs that decided to shut down. And on Tyneside, the Northeastern combination was formed from the semi-professional clubs in the area who were willing to continue. McCracken was one of several international players who played for South Shields in the 1915-16 season, and other teams like Scotswood and Sunderland Rovers could also field elite professional players. And also migrating were some fans from St James's Park and Roker Park. One correspondent, Riley, noted that after only a few games, to quote, "There are quite a number of people you meet who knew not these grounds before the beginning of the season, but now comport themselves though they were the oldest inhabitants." The 1915-16 season also saw McCracken emerge as an organiser and participant in charity football matches. And in doing so, he and his fellow players took a proactive stance, one that contrasted with the relative passive one of the Durham and Northumberland Footballers Associations. But this came a point of conflict in the autumn of 1915 when McCracken and Jack Pert, a striker with Notts County, but now back on his native Tyneside, organised a game for the widow of a local player killed at the front. When the players arrived at the game, they found officials from the Northumberland FA checking the gate receipts. And while the players' post-match complaints were amicably resolved, journalist Robert Craig criticised the innuendos thrown by officials who had done nothing to raise money for soldiers at the front, but who cast doubt on the financial probity of the players involved in the fundraising. For the following season in 1916 and 17, McCracken again found himself without a club when South Shields shut down. And James Lawrence, the Scottish international goalkeeper at Newcastle United, and who had played alongside McCracken at South Shields, explained that this was due to the difficulty of getting players together from their munitions work, which prevented them from getting to early kickoffs. Instead, McCracken turned his focus to a side known variously as Newcastle Munition Workers Football Club, or McCracken's 11. In essence, it was a star touring side filled with many of McCracken's international and elite colleagues from Newcastle United, Sunderland and Middlesbrough. They played a series of charity games across the region, which, according to Lawrence, had the atmosphere of an operatic company on tour. And James Lawrence clearly involved reporting on the team's visits to the outlying districts of the North East coalfields, where leading internationals might be whisked from the local train station to the game in horse-drawn carts. Again, this side of football was not without its controversial side. One of the club officials and sometimes player was David Brooks, a former Belfast distillery player. The combined minutes of the Northumberland and Durham Football Association record that in his capacity as Secretary of Newcastle Munitions Workers FC, Brooks was involved in financial discrepancies relating to ticket sales for a charity competition, and he was ordered to repay over £3 to the charity organisers and told that he and the other secretary involved were being closely watched. McCracken's 11 was not the limit, though, of his charitable activities, which took on another dimension in the final 2 years of the war. In February 1917, he refereed the second recorded game of wartime women's football in the northeast of England, when Northeastern Marine beat Wallsend Slipway 2-0. The northeast of England witnessed the largest and most sophisticated women's football culture in England during the war. At least 81 teams played at least 235 games between 1916 and 1918, while a major cup competition was created. Representative games were also organised on a regional level, and in December 1917, a Proto International was held in Belfast. And it seems that McCracken was the key link that resulted in that northeastern side billed as England travelling to Belfast to play an international with an Irish women's side on Boxing Day. McCracken was the match referee for that game too, whilst teammate James Lawrence ran one line and Irish international Mick Hamill the other. And the game attracted a crowd of between 12,000 to 20,000 and raising £450 for war charities. And also travelling with the team as its manager was David Brooks, although according to one of the English players who was speaking to a niece many years later, His most notable contribution was to get drunk on the ship across and to lock himself into the toilets, where he sang, "Waiter, waiter, bring me some paper for my bumper later." McCracken would go on to be involved in two of the largest crowds involving English sides between 1915 and 1918. On the 8th of June 1918, he played at Celtic's home ground before 45,000 spectators in an unofficial England versus Scotland game known as the Hague International, which raised £1,300 for Douglas Haig's base hospital scheme. The England side came primarily from players based in the northeast of England, and when several were forced to drop out at the last minute, McCracken stepped up to become an honorary Englishman for the day. And he was praised in the press reports for how well he performed. He also got to play against England in October 1918, when he arranged for another unofficial England side to travel to Belfast to play England in a men's international. And around 30,000 fans raised £1,200 for war charities in a game formerly supported by Lord and Lady Londonderry. And both these women's games and these men's games played an important part in sort of healing the breach between the IFA and McCracken that ultimately led to him returning to official international football in 1919. And so while his peacetime career has attracted deserved attention, his wartime career is arguably no less important in understanding how he used his stardom to benefit the war effort. And for my final section, I'd like to focus on Belfast as an important site in the development of international women's football, both during the war and in the immediate post-war period. The photograph you can see here is from 1921, when Windsor Park hosted a game billed as England versus Ireland in honour of Mrs. Walter Scott. And despite bad weather, 10,000 spectators attended the game. Only 4 years earlier, Mrs. Scott had organised her first women's game, helping to raise funds for charities during the war. But in the intervening years, she'd become a leading figure, credited as the pioneer of ladies' football in Ireland. And now her efforts in promoting women's games on behalf of wartime and post-war charities was being recognised in spectacular fashion. And that so many people turned out in bad weather says a great deal, not only about the popularity of women's football, but of the regard in which Mrs. Walter Scott was held. It took me some time to actually find out precisely who Mrs. Scott was, partly because her Christian name was never used in any of the contemporary reports, which stuck to contemporary fashion in calling her Mrs. Walter Scott, obscuring her identity as an individual woman. By cross-referencing small clues in newspaper reports and the 1911 census, it's been possible to find her marriage certificate, which helps pull these details together. Her maiden name was Diana MacDonald, and in the 1911 census, she and her husband can be found living at 21 Lothair Avenue in Antrim. In Duncan, Antrim. She was 25 years old, whilst he was 24, and it reveals that they were married in Belfast in 1910, and that her father was a publican, whilst the 1911 census describes Walter's father as a buyer for wholesale warehouses. Walter worked as a shipbuilding clerk, and both he and Diana were Presbyterians. Walter's family was quite a sporting one, and he and all of his other brothers were all active in the football community in different ways. Another significant piece of evidence about the couple is the 1912 Ulster Covenant, which Walter signed, as did many other men and women at their new address at Marsden Gardens in North Belfast. But Diana didn't sign it. And Diana's father is also absent from the list, perhaps indicating that their family did not support signing the covenant. And on this central issue, Diana differed from her husband and much of the community, indicating some of the independent choices that women actively made in their public and private lives. It's not known whether Walter joined the Ulster Volunteer Force, but it's also clear that he did not join the British Army during the First World War. Instead, in October 1915, he became the secretary of Distillery FC, one of Belfast's leading professional clubs. And whilst he did not serve during the war, he and Diana would have been keenly aware of the impact of the war on the communities they belonged to. Newspaper reports from this period carry the news of deaths of several former distillery players or club members. The one you can see here is sadly Private Donald Sloan, a former goalkeeper with Distillery, Everton and Liverpool. His widow lost one of her 4 children 3 months later after his death, whereupon she returned to her native Belfast. Like many other women, Diana became heavily involved in organising and supporting wartime charities. Some joined or worked for pre-existing organisations, but some also set up their own ones. And Diana was credited with inaugurating the Ladies Football Guild during the 1916-17 season, and she was later described as a strenuous worker in the cause of war charities. She forwards a parcel of good things fortnightly to all those sporting boys of Belfast in the trenches and collects the wherewithal at matches in all kinds of weather. And it seems possible the guild had its own, each club had its own section as part of the guild, with activities being reported in connection with Linfield on a regular basis. The Diana's shift into organising games took place in 1917, roughly in line with the rise of popularity of women's football across the United Kingdom. And it's important to highlight here that from what we know of the development of women's football in the First World War, she seems to have been the only spouse of a club official to take a leading role in the organisation of women's games, something that tended to be the preserve of male officials. And here importance seems to be recognised from the start. In September 1917, the Belfast newsletter paid detailed coverage to the reception afforded to the players and officials involved in the game for the Belfast Service Club, held at the Distillery Ground. It was a great success with about 16,000 spectators attending, and under the title Lady Footballers, Handsome Contribution, the paper described how the players and Mrs. Scott were gifted handsome mementos in the shape of silver satchels, and that both Diana and her husband Walter were applauded when they handed the chairman the cheque for over £230. Some £400 to £700 seems to have been raised in 3 well-attended games between April and November 1917. But however, the most notable triumph of football's football career to date was still to come. And I nearly discussed the 1917 Boxing Day Women's International game between England and Ireland. And whilst Diana was not mentioned by name in the organisation of the game, the Ladies Guild was mentioned as being the organisers. And as we can see in this slide, on partway in the mid of the midst of the receipts, you can see that she's named in connection to the distribution of the money. And if you possibly might not be able to see, I'll just highlight it though. Her address includes, interestingly, the name of Theatval, which suggests that the couple may have even named their house after the site of the 36th Ulster Division's attack on the Battle of the Somme in 1916. From this, we can see that the donations went partly to the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, and also to provide 2 local hospital beds, which were to be named Lady Footballers in memory of the fallen memories of the Distillery Football Club. So Diana continued her efforts throughout 1918, gathering further praise. And she was also involved in a proposed visit to Newcastle. She was involved in a visit to Newcastle with an Irish team for a return of the international game they were played. These games were part of the Lord Mayor's Relief Fund in Newcastle and was held at St James's Park, home of Newcastle United. But sadly, bad weather and the Spanish flu pandemic meant a disappointing crowd of 2,000 people. Diana accompanied the team as their manager, and in the absence of the Lord Mayor, she was given the honour of kicking off the game, which ended in a 5-2 win for England. She also turned her hand to organising men's football games during the war, and by the end of the war, she'd earned a formidable reputation as a charity organiser. And as a result, she was honoured, as we've seen, with the testimonial game, a rare and notable tribute for a female administrator connected with football. This was not the end, though, of Diana's involvement, nor in visits from English sides to Belfast, with 4 more in 1921. One of those who visited were the Fleetwood ladies, who you can see here in this photograph. And they have an additional, they played several games in Belfast in aid of both local and post-war charities. And there's an additional Irish connection in this photograph through the team secretary, James Henry Longworth, who you can see in the overcoat and hat on the sort of, as I'm looking at the right-hand side of the team. In 1915, his youngest son, David, lied about his age to enlist in the British Army. And although he was discharged in 1916 after serving 7 months at the front, he later rejoined the army in 1918. He was sent to France, where he rejoined the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Inniskilling Regiment in the 36th Ulster Division, and with whom he was serving when he was killed in action on the 3rd of October, 1918. So for his father, the game was an opportunity to visit a city closely connected to his dead son's military service. And another team to visit was the famous Dick Kerr Ladies of FC of Preston. And their manager on their trip also picked out Mr. and Mrs. Scott for praise at the post-match banquet. But whereas the Dick Kerr Ladies have become one of the most famous women's teams in the game's history, Diana Scott and her Belfast players are only recently attracting the attention they deserve. So I'm just going to draw my talk to a conclusion now, but I hope that I've shown that the home front during the Great War is a serious and important subject. And thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you.